What happens when a military that has spent years building its entire southern strategy around a single supply route suddenly discovers that route is no longer safe, and the weapons destroying it cost less than $50,000 each? Before we dive into this extraordinary story of how Ukraine just systematically dismantled Russia's logistical lifeline to Crimea, hit that like button right now, because understanding this means understanding why Russia's hold on the peninsula is more fragile than ever. Subscribe if you want to follow this conflict as it actually unfolds with the kind of grounded analysis you will not find anywhere else. And send this to someone who still thinks Russia's grip on Crimea is unbreakable, because the numbers tell a very different story. 71%. That is the number you need to hold in your head before anything else, because everything that follows only makes sense if you understand what that figure actually means. In the space of 2 weeks in June 2026, Russian military cargo traffic along the single most important overland supply route keeping Russian forces in occupied Crimea, fed, fueled, and armed, collapsed by 71%. Not disrupted, not slowed down, collapsed. Daily freight moving along that corridor dropped from roughly 3,800 vehicles per day to around 1,100. And the man who told the world that number did not deliver it in a carefully worded press release from a capital city briefing room. He delivered it from a command post near the front line in an interview with Reuters, while his drone units were still in the air and still hitting targets. His name is Robert Brovdi. His call sign is Magyar. And what he and the Ukrainian unmanned systems forces he commands have done to Russia's ability to supply the 40,000 or more troops stationed across occupied Crimea and the broader southern front is something military logisticians will study for the next generation. Let me start with the geography, because you cannot understand the scale of what happened here without understanding what Russia was working with before any of this began. Crimea is a peninsula. It connects to the rest of the world through a narrow set of choke points. And Russia's ability to hold it, supply it, and use it as a military base depends entirely on keeping those choke points functional. There are two primary ways to move anything significant into or out of Crimea. The first is the Kerch Bridge, the 19-kilometer road and rail crossing that Putin inaugurated in 2018 as a symbol of Russian permanence over the annexed territory, the physical embodiment of the claim that Crimea was now and forever Russian. The second is the land corridor running north from Crimea through the Perekop Isthmus, and then east through occupied Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, connecting to the M14 highway, which Russian occupation authorities renamed the Novorossiya Highway, running all the way to Rostov-on-Don in Russia proper via Mariupol and Berdyansk. That highway is 700 kilometers long. It became the primary supply artery for Crimea after Ukrainian strikes in 2022. In 2023, damaged the Kerch Bridge badly enough that Russia banned heavy and hazardous cargo, specifically including fuel, from crossing it. Fuel tankers banned from the bridge. Think about what that means for a peninsula that needs a continuous flow of fuel to keep its military forces operational, its generators running, and its population supplied. The bridge became decorative for the most critical category of supply, which made the land corridor through the north the only realistic route for moving the one thing an army cannot function without. That was the architecture Russia built its southern logistics around. In Ukraine, spent the spring and summer of 2026 systematically taking it apart, bridge by bridge, truck by truck, fuel depot by fuel depot, using a class of weapons cheap enough to produce in the hundreds and precise enough to hit moving targets on a 700-kilometer highway from drone units operating in underground command rooms at undisclosed locations inside Ukraine. The campaign has a name. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense and General Staff called it the Logistics Lockdown. Its declared objective, in the words of Ukraine's Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov, was to destroy Russia's ability to move personnel, weapons, and equipment to the front. The strike force built to execute it was not long-range cruise missiles or Western-supplied precision weapons. It was middle-strike class drones with flight ranges of up to 200 kilometers, produced domestically, some of them costing less than $50,000 per unit. And the 414th Unmanned Strike Aviation Brigade, the formation Robert Brovdi commands, became the operational arm driving that campaign forward on a daily basis. If you are finding this breakdown valuable, drop a like right now and share this video with anyone trying to understand the real mechanics of Ukraine's logistical campaign. This is the kind of context that completely changes how you see the news. The groundwork started before the headline strikes. From January through March of 2026, Ukrainian drone strikes on Crimea's fuel infrastructure were relatively sporadic, 1 or 2 per month, probing for gaps, testing Russian air defense reactions, mapping the network. Starting in April, they became weekly. By June, some weeks saw strikes on consecutive days. The Vardisa fuel depot was hit on January 8th. The Azovska fuel depot followed in March. The Feodosia Sea oil terminal already struck in October 2025 when more Then half of its 43 storage tanks were destroyed. It was hit again in April, specifically targeting the tanks that had survived the first strike. Ukraine was not hitting targets randomly. It was methodically working through every link in the fuel supply chain simultaneously. Logistics, meaning ports where fuel moved from tankers onto shore, transshipment facilities where fuel was accumulated before distribution, storage sites where fuel was held before being sent forward. A strike on any single link limits supply. A strike on all three at once creates a systemic crisis. That is exactly what was building across the spring of 2026 before the campaign reached a completely different level of intensity in June. June 7th is where the escalation becomes unmistakable. On that night, Ukrainian forces struck the Chonhar Bridge, the crossing over the Sivash that carried the M14 Novorossiya Highway into Crimea from occupied Kherson region, using FPV attack drones and a newly unveiled Ukrainian-made strike drone called the Behemoth, a medium-range platform with a wingspan just over 2 meters and a flight range of up to 300 kilometers. It was the first known combat use of the Behemoth. The Chonhar Bridge was struck again on June 9th. By June 10th, Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation confirmed the crossing had been destroyed. Russia's own occupation authorities in Kherson confirmed the damage and suspended traffic. In its place, Russia reopened a pontoon bridge nearby, one that had first been laid in 2023 when an earlier storm shadow strike damaged the same crossing and then sat unused for 3 years once the bridge was repaired. The fact that a pontoon bridge was even available tells you something about how long Russia had been living under the shadow of this vulnerability, patching it and hoping the patch held. It did not hold because Ukraine was not done with the Chonhar Bridge. It was one node in a network, and the network had other nodes. On the night of June 10th into June 11th, Ukrainian forces carried out what the 1st Separate Assault Regiment, named after Dmytro Kotyubailo, later confirmed was a coordinated multi-bridge strike operation covering multiple crossings simultaneously. The Armyansk Bridge, over the North Crimean Canal near the Perekop Isthmus, the northern gateway into Crimea, was struck. Bridges near the settlements of Poznya and Minsk were struck. The road bridge on the Perekop-Armyansk route was struck. A bridge near the village of Stavki was struck. Vladimir Saldo, the Russian-installed head of occupied Kherson Oblast, acknowledged the damage across multiple crossings in an early morning telegram post and published a map showing drivers 2 alternative routes to reach Armyansk. Detours through Novorossiyivka, Askanyanova, and Shaplinka, significantly longer, significantly more exposed to the same drone campaign that had just destroyed the direct routes. But the single most operationally significant event of that night was what happened at the Armyansk Bridge itself because of what was sitting next to it when Ukrainian precision systems arrived. Up to 50 Russian military trucks were concentrated near the bridge at the moment of impact. They were loaded with ammunition and fuel. They were being staged for deployment. Toward the Zaporizhia direction, toward the front line where Russian forces had been pressing hard, the strike hit them while they were queued and stationary. The 1st Separate Assault Regiment confirmed the strike had rendered the bridge inoperable, adding a detail that tells you how precisely Ukraine was calibrating its tools by this point. The bridge had already been taken out of service by Firepoint systems during earlier strikes and did not require a repeat strike. An important enemy logistics route had been completely paralyzed. No intact bridges for Russian. Military logistics from occupied Crimea to the mainland remained functional. Let me be precise about what that sentence actually means, because it is easy to let it slide past as one more battlefield claim in a war full of them. Before this campaign began, Russia had built its entire southern logistics architecture around the assumption that the land corridor through Armyansk, Chonhar, and Henikesk was a resilient, difficult to permanently disable route precisely because it consisted of multiple crossings spread across different approaches to the peninsula. Hit one bridge, and traffic reroutes through another. That is how a network is supposed to function. What Ukraine demonstrated across the week of June 7th through June 11th is that it could hit all of them inside a single operational window, faster than Russia could repair, reroute, or defend any of them. And it did so with drones costing tens of thousands of dollars against bridges that Russia would need weeks and significant engineering resources to restore. The cost arithmetic is not close. One side is burning through cheap drones. The other side is burning through bridges it built to last decades. From the beginning of May 2026 through June 20th alone, according to research compiled by French open-source analyst Clément Milan, Ukrainian forces carried out more than 500 individual strikes against Russian trucks and other vehicles using this corridor. On June 19th, 20th, and 21st alone, 90 Russian trucks and vehicles were destroyed in 3 days. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, tracked 361 separate attacks within a 20-kilometer buffer zone along the M14 highway and its associated crossings in just the first 6 months of 2026. And Robert Brovdi, speaking to reporters, was careful to frame what he was observing accurately. Traffic collapse is not a blockade, he said. He was right to make that distinction. But a 71% reduction in daily freight movement along the artery supplying an entire military garrison and an occupied civilian population is not a minor logistical inconvenience. That is a tourniquet applied slowly, then all at once. At this point, if you are enjoying this deep dive and want to stay updated on how this story develops, make sure you are subscribed. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and join our community of viewers who understand that the real story is always what happens beneath the surface. Now let us talk about what a tourniquet feels like on the receiving end, because the consequences of this campaign have not stayed abstract. They have shown up in the daily lives of everyone inside the peninsula, military and civilian alike, with a speed and visibility that makes the usual habit of minimizing such things quite difficult. The fuel crisis in Crimea did not arrive suddenly. It announced itself in stages, each one tighter than the last, like a government quietly escalating an admission it would rather not be making. In late May, rationing began. On May 30th, Sergei Aksionov, the Russian-installed head of Crimea, introduced a limit of 20 liters of fuel per person per day, mirroring restrictions that had already been imposed in Sevastopol. In Sevastopol, by June 6th, the TS gas station network was requiring QR codes for fuel coupons, each code entitling the holder to 20 liters, obtainable only once per week, only through a state-backed messaging app. Daily quotas were selling out within hours of opening. Residents of Sevastopol who spoke to independent journalists described the process of trying to obtain a QR code in language that sounds more like a Soviet-era queue than a city in the 21st century. One woman told the Moscow Times she gathered 10 friends at her apartment, all of them repeatedly refreshing the app on their phones, hoping one of them would manage to secure a code for her car's tank. In the end, several of them failed. A photograph circulated on social media of a sign on a gas station door reading, "No fuel at all." On June 21st, the rationing stopped being rationing. Aksionov announced that as of 9 in the morning, all gas stations in Crimea had completely stopped selling fuel to civilians. Not limited sales, not restricted sales. Stopped. Fuel would be dispensed only to government agencies responsible for the functioning and security of the Republic of Crimea, he said. The same day, Sevastopol's governor made an identical announcement, suspending distribution via QR codes and restricting sales exclusively to emergency services, police, public transport, and municipal workers. An entire occupied peninsula, home to hundreds of thousands of civilians and tens of thousands of Russian military personnel, was operating on a zero civilian fuel policy. You could not buy gasoline legally. There was no mechanism to do so. On June 26th, 5 days later, Aksionov and Razvozhaev jointly signed decrees declaring a formal state of emergency across Crimea and Sevastopol, effective immediately for an indefinite period. The state of emergency took in fuel, electricity, and food. Civilian vehicles were backed up 15 kilometers at the Kerch Bridge, which remained the only major route. Still nominally operational, though heavily restricted on weight and vehicle type. Ferry services in Sevastopol were canceled. Street lighting was switched off. Outdoor gatherings were banned. Gasoline prices in Sevastopol jumped 30% in a single week as black market trading filled the void left by the official shutdown. Speculators were reselling whatever fuel they could obtain at double the market rate. The Kremlin-installed governor of Sevastopol acknowledged publicly that the energy supply situation remained difficult and that restrictions would remain in place for at least another month. Let me pause here and be precise about what we actually know versus what remains uncertain, because this story is genuinely significant, and it deserves honesty rather than amplification. The Kerch Bridge is still standing. Traffic on it, while heavily restricted, is not completely severed. Russia has been constructing earthen bypass roads and pontoon crossings at the damaged bridge sites as engineering workarounds, and some limited logistics flow continues through those improvised routes. Brovdi himself said explicitly that what Ukraine had achieved by early June was traffic collapse, not a full blockade. Those are not the same thing. Russian forces in Crimea and on the southern front have not run out of ammunition or been forced to withdraw from their positions. The military situation on the ground is not yet being driven purely by Crimea's logistical isolation. The Institute for the Study of War has assessed that Russian forces appear to be struggling to adapt to the Ukrainian strikes, but are still able to function, in part because Russian occupation authorities have been forced to independently take measures to increase mobile air defense in Crimea, precisely because the Ministry of Defense's responses have been so inadequate. And some Russian military cargo has reportedly begun moving under concealment, using tarpaulins laid over trucks to disguise fuel loads from drone cameras, tucking supplies underneath grain shipments and civilian cargo to reduce their signature. None of that changes what the numbers show, but honest analysis means presenting the complete picture not just the most dramatic version of it. What this campaign has accomplished verifiably and on the record is the systematic degradation of the single logistical architecture Russia built its entire southern military posture around, using a weapon class no one outside Ukraine's defense ministry had treated as strategically significant before this spring. The middle strike drone, flying 100 to 300 kilometers. Behind the front line, hunting trucks on a 700-kilometer highway, hitting bridges at night with payloads costing $50,000 or less per unit, has done something that Ukraine's entire 2023 counteroffensive with Western-supplied tanks and infantry failed to accomplish on the ground. It has put the land corridor to Crimea under a level of operational pressure that is forcing Russia to make choices it cannot make well, because there are no good choices available. Think about what the Russian commander responsible for Crimea's logistics is now contending with. Reinforce the bridge. Crossings and corridor roads with air defense assets, and the units being stripped from somewhere else, almost certainly from the front line itself, where Ukrainian forces are pressing the Zaporizhzhia direction. Or continue relying on the pontoon workarounds and alternative detour routes and hope they absorb enough of the shortfall to keep forces supplied. Or attempt to dramatically increase the volume moving across the Kerch Bridge by lifting restrictions on heavy cargo. A decision complicated by the fact that the bridge itself remains structurally vulnerable after multiple attacks in 2022, 2023, and 2025, and Russia has explicitly kept fuel tankers off it for security reasons since those earlier strikes. Every option costs Russia something it cannot easily spare, and Ukraine is not asking Russia to choose once. It is forcing Russia to answer that question every single day, at every functional crossing along every kilometer of exposed highway, for as long as Ukraine's drone production lines keep turning out the weapons capable of making the question lethal. As we approach the end of this analysis, if you have made it this far, you are exactly the kind of viewer who wants to understand the world beyond the headlines. Drop a like, share this with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive. Your engagement keeps this channel going and helps us bring you the context that mainstream media often misses. The broader strategic logic of this campaign was stated clearly by an SBU Major General on June 22nd, speaking to Union. The campaign's objective, he said, was not yet a Ukrainian ground offensive to liberate Crimea. The goal was to make maintaining the Russian military occupation of Crimea as difficult and expensive as possible. That framing matters. It is not the language of a side claiming to have won. It is the language of a side that has figured out how to impose a cost that compounds month after month in ways Russia's military and economic planners were not built to absorb. And the numbers backing that framing up are not coming exclusively from Ukraine's own military. The Atlantic Council, in a June 30th analysis, described Crimea's military significance to Russia in terms that explain precisely why this campaign matters beyond the peninsula itself. Since 2022, the Atlantic Council noted, Crimea has served as a key staging post and supply route for the hundreds of thousands of Russian troops based in southern Ukraine. The peninsula is not just home to a garrison, it is the logistics hub feeding a much larger force operating along the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson fronts. When Crimea's internal fuel supply collapses, the effect propagates outward. Military units, drawing supplies from Crimean stockpiles, face shortages. Operations dependent on fuel moving through the peninsula get disrupted. The southern front becomes less sustainable. Not because any specific Ukrainian ground assault has broken through Russian lines, but because the system supplying those lines is quietly hemorrhaging at a rate Russia's repair capacity cannot keep pace with. Here's where the arithmetic starts to matter in a way that should make anyone tracking this war sit up. The behemoth drone that Ukraine used against the Chonhar Bridge costs less than $50,000. The Storm Shadow cruise missile Ukraine used to damage the same bridge in 2023 cost approximately $2 million, 40 times more for a similar tactical result. The FPV drones hunting fuel trucks on the Novorossiya Highway are similarly cheap, produced at scale inside Ukraine, replaceable in days, not weeks. Russia, to adequately defend a 700-kilometer highway against this campaign, would need to position air defense assets along its entire length at a density it simply does not have available, given that those same assets are simultaneously needed over Moscow, over the front line, over weapons production facilities being targeted by longer-range Ukrainian strikes. There is no configuration of Russian air defense inventory that covers all of those requirements simultaneously. Something is always going to be exposed, and Ukraine has spent the spring and summer of 2026 proving very publicly that it knows exactly where the exposed places are. From the beginning of May through late June, Ukrainian forces struck more than 500 individual targets along the M14 corridor alone, 90 vehicles in 3 days in the third week of June, 361. Recorded attacks within the highway buffer zone in the first 6 months of the year. The Medusa news outlet tracked 270 separately confirmed strikes on Russian trucks and logistics centers in 2026 alone before the campaign entered its most intense phase. And Robert Bravdi, by early July, was issuing public warnings directly to Russian truck drivers through Telegram, telling them their flip-flops would melt along with their gas pedals if they continued to take contract work moving cargo toward Crimea. It was not a metaphor, it was a literal operational outcome he was describing, backed by footage of more than 200 confirmed vehicle strikes released publicly by his command. Now zoom out, because this campaign does not exist in isolation, and the failure to see it in context is how the significance of what Ukraine has achieved gets routinely underestimated in coverage that treats each individual bridge strike as a single tactical event rather than a data point in a strategic pattern. What Ukraine is demonstrating in the south in the summer of 2026 is the same underlying logic this channel has documented across the deep strike campaign targeting Russian refineries, missile factories, and satellite communications infrastructure. The logic is this: Russia built its military posture around assumptions about what was safe. Crimea, as an occupied peninsula guarded by multiple crossings and defended by layered air defense, was assumed to be a resilient rear area from which force could be generated and logistics could flow toward the front. That assumption required the crossings to remain functional. It required the highway to be passable. It required fuel storage to be intact. Strip away any one of those requirements and the posture strains. Strip away all three simultaneously, persistently, at a cost per strike the attacker can sustain far longer than the defender can absorb, and the posture collapses. Russia has responded to the bridge strikes by building pontoon crossings. It has responded to the highway attacks by moving cargo under cover of tarpaulins and darkness. It has responded to the fuel depot strikes by declaring a state of emergency and banning civilian fuel sales. Each response is tactically logical and strategically insufficient. The pontoon crossings are slower, more limited in capacity, and still within range of the same drones that destroyed the fixed bridges. The concealed cargo convoys still have to move down exposed roads that Ukrainian drone operators have been hunting for months. The state of emergency in Crimea is a public admission, signed into law with a start date and an indefinite end date, that the system designed to keep the peninsula supplied is not working. And Russia cannot easily fix the thing that is broken, because the thing that is broken is not any single bridge or any single fuel depot. It is the assumption that the distances involved, the geographic depth of the peninsula's connection to mainland Russia, provided inherent protection from this kind of sustained operational pressure. That assumption was invalidated in stages, starting when cheap drones began hunting convoys on the Novorossiya Highway in May, accelerating when the Chonhar and Kerch bridges fell in June, and confirmed when the Armyansk crossing was rendered inoperable with 50 military trucks burning beside it on the night of June 10th and 11th. The Russian military on the southern front is now operating in an environment where its primary supply route is 71% reduced from its pre-campaign baseline. Its secondary maritime fuel supply through Kerch has been disrupted by strikes on the TES terminal, Port Kavkaz, and the Feodosia Sea Oil terminal. Its air defense assets in Crimea are insufficient to stop the campaign that is causing all of this damage. And the civilian population of the territory it occupies has been formally cut off from fuel sales for weeks. That is not a single tactical defeat. That is a logistical system failing under sustained pressure. It was never designed to absorb from weapons. It was never built to stop. Watch what happens at the Kerch Bridge over the coming weeks, because it remains the one major artery through which Russia can still move meaningful volumes of cargo. And Ukraine has explicitly struck targets on both sides of it, including the Port Kavkaz fuel terminal on the Russian side and the TES terminal oil depot on the Crimean side. Whether Ukraine moves toward directly targeting the bridge structure itself rather than its surrounding infrastructure will tell you a great deal about where this campaign's ambitions actually sit. Watch whether Russian forces in southern Ukraine show any measurable degradation in operational tempo, in artillery rates, in the pace of assault activity. Because the correlation between logistical pressure and frontline effectiveness is not always visible immediately, but always shows up eventually. Watch whether Russia attempts to relocate meaningful air defense assets toward the Novorossiya corridor or the northern Crimean crossings, because every battery moved south to protect the supply route is a battery no longer covering something else, and Ukraine has demonstrated it understands exactly how to exploit that trade-off. And watch the state of emergency in Crimea, because Aksyonov and Razvozhayev declared it for an indefinite period. And a government that was confident in its ability to restore normal supply flows does not issue emergency decrees with no specified end date. For 12 years, Russia held Crimea and treated it as settled fact. The land bridge through occupied southern Ukraine was supposed to guarantee that even if the Kerch Bridge became vulnerable, the peninsula would never be truly isolated. That guarantee has been revoked bridge by bridge, truck by truck, fuel depot by fuel depot, by drone units operating out of underground command rooms, flying weapons that cost a fraction of the infrastructure they are destroying. Robert Bravdi, Magyar, told Reuters he would isolate Crimea in the near future. He said it while his drones were still in the air. The 71% collapse in military cargo traffic was already the evidence that what he described was not ambition. It was a status report. Stay informed, and I will see you with the next update.